Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe into the darkest corners of medieval Europe where the dead don't always stay buried, and the living aren't always honest. You find yourself in the thick of night, the air wet with fog, and the stink of freshly turned earth. A crow croaks from the chapel spire, and somewhere nearby, a spade sinks into soft soil with a rhythm that's far too casual for a cemetery. You crouch beside a lichen-covered gravestone, heart thudding as you spy a hooded figure lifting a wooden lid. It creaks open and there it is. A corpse. Still pale. Still dressed. Still warm enough to make you wonder, how long has it even been? You probably won't survive this, you know. Not from ghosts or curses but from the stench. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval graveyard is not a place of peace. It's a market quiet, earthy, shadowy. And what's being sold? Not flowers, not candles, but flesh, bone, the occasional gold tooth if you're lucky. In this world, the soil above a corpse is as temporary as a blanket on a restless sleeper. You're watching a trade in motion, men working fast, some barefoot to avoid detection, others with soft leather gloves to avoid a sound. A sack waits nearby, stiff with dried blood. You can almost hear the coin purse clinking before it ever changes hands. Why is this happening? Because death has value, and the newly dead, even more. Historians still argue whether the practice of corpse theft was primarily driven by scientific progress or sheer economic despair. But one thing is certain. If someone was buried in the last 72 hours, they were fair game. The term resurrection man sounds noble until you realize he's hauling your grandma through the mud for a handful of coins. You move behind the church wall as another group arrives, less coordinated, noisier. Amateurs. You can tell because they dig from the head instead of the feet. A rookie mistake. The seasoned ones know to dig at the head end, loop a rope under the shoulders, and pull upward in a single movement. Efficient, disturbing, impressively gross. It's not just about selling bodies whole. Some thieves specialize in specific parts. Teeth fetch a high price with dentists. Fingers with rings? Even better. Long bones are perfect for apothecaries who grind them into powder for tinctures. And skulls. Everyone loves a nice skull on their desk, right? Not everyone doing this is some cloaked villain. You meet a gaunt-faced farmer in patched wool who lost 3 children to winter and a wife to plague. He doesn't want to be here, but the anatomy college pays in silver, and the harvest was poor. That's the thing about corpse robbing. It wasn't always evil. Often, it was practical. Just another way to survive when bread costs more than life. And sometimes, the family themselves gave a nod, quietly. A grieving daughter might leave the gate unlatched. A widow might hum by the fire as strangers carry her husband away, knowing that body will feed her children for a week. Still, it's not all sympathy and survival. Sometimes, it's competition. Gangs form. Territories are marked. You hear whispers of rival robbers, sabotaging each other, collapsing graves halfway through a job, or tipping off the priest just to drive out the competition. One time, in York, an entire brawl broke out inside the cemetery at midnight. Eyewitnesses say 2 men dueled with femurs like swords. You can picture it. Moonlight, glinting off pale bone. Dirt flying. The dead watching quietly beneath them. Local sheriffs pretend not to notice. Unless they're not getting a cut, of course. The graveyard you're in now? It has a reputation. Everyone in the village knows not to bury valuables with the dead. Or if they must, to crush the jewelry beforehand. A broken brooch might not be worth stealing, but whole gold rings? Consider them already gone. Oddly, some towns even account for theft and burial costs. Reburying services appear in church records. A small fee, really, Pay once to dig, pay again to cover up someone else's mess. A few communities fight back. You see signs of it here. Iron cages over fresh graves, known as mort-safe grills. They're heavy, welded shut, and expensive. Only the rich could afford to keep their bones in peace. The poor? They got buried twice. Once by the grieving, then again by the thieves. You stumble across one fresh grave with the earth still soft, but the coffin already splintered. A single shoe lies next to it, small, buckled, belonging to a child. You pause. For a moment, it's hard to justify this grim little industry. But before your thoughts get too heavy, you hear footsteps, more thieves arriving. Time to move. You duck into a side path, stepping over wilted flowers, past crosses stuck at odd angles. The night air grows heavier. You breathe it in. You're getting used to the smell now. That might not be a good sign. Soon you'll learn it's not just random criminals doing this. Sometimes it's respected professionals, even scholars. But for now, you follow the path toward a flickering light. At the edge of the graveyard may be a chapel, maybe something worse. And behind you, someone whispers, "Don't worry, he won't miss it." You follow the flickering light past the last rows of tilted gravestones, their names long since eroded into lichen and nothing. The soft squelch of your boots in the earth reminds you that not all ground here is solid. Some graves were never filled right. Or maybe they were, and then emptied again. A lantern sways ahead. Not the warm, golden kind from bedtime stories, but a mean, smoky flame trapped behind rusted glass. Its bearer leans on a spade, coat stitched from patches of old sacks, hat crushed low over his brow. He isn't startled by you, just annoyed. There's competition tonight, and he knows it. "Too many hands in the dirt," he mutters, jerking his chin at the field. "Not enough meat." You nod politely, though your stomach turns at the word. Meat, in this context, doesn't mean pork or mutton. This is what people rarely imagine about medieval Europe. Beyond the castles and jousts, beyond the plague doctors and flagellants, there was a persistent class of people surviving on whatever scraps society left them. And sometimes, those scraps had once worn shoes. You learn quickly that corpse theft wasn't just about selling whole bodies. In fact, for many, it wasn't about money at all. It was about not starving. The man with the lantern explains how he first dug up a grave because his wife hadn't eaten in 2 days. That body skin still soft, fingers ringless but intact, bought him 3 loaves of barley bread and a bit of smoked eel. That's more than a day's wage for most. And all it cost was a little shame and a lot of bleach. Mainstream historical records do support this. During the leanest years, particularly the 1317 Great Famine, entire villages were reduced to desperate acts. Pet cats disappeared. Bark was stripped from trees. And yes, graves were disturbed not only for valuables, but for, let's call it, salvageable protein. That part? Historians still argue whether medieval people actually practiced cannibalism during famines, or if such accounts were exaggerated for drama and demonization. But whispers in local chronicles, and the frantic laws passed afterwards, suggest someone was doing something dark with the dead. You pass a crumbling wooden fence, following a narrow trail down into a hollow where smoke coils out of a stone chimney. A shack clings to the hillside, barely upright, its roof patched with rope and waxed cloth. The inside smells like boiled onions and iron. A woman with a red scarf, tied around her neck, hunches over a pot, stirring slowly. She doesn't look up. You ask what she does with the bodies. "Sell 'em," she says flatly. "Fingers to the barber, teeth to the guild, bones to the alchemist, organs to the man at the docks. Rest I burn." She stirs again, the ladle scraping the pot's edge, with a sound like bone against metal. You glance into a crate by the hearth. It's filled with foot bonestini. White, all cleaned. One still has a toe ring. There's a certain efficiency here, like a grim medieval butcher shop. And just like in any market, specialization exists. Some grave robbers work alone. Some form crews. One man scouts the church calendar to know when the graveyard will be busiest. Another keeps records of who died wealthy and who died young. Kids are easiest light to carry and more likely to be unspoiled. A word that makes your stomach churn again. Your new host offers you a place by the fire. You decline. Outside, the wind picks up. Somewhere in the hills, a dog howls. Or maybe a wolf. Or maybe just your nerves. The truth is, medieval people didn't see the dead the way we do. The body wasn't sacred in itself, it was a shell. The soul had gone. And if the shell could be reused, repurposed, sold, well, why not? Some towns even treated the dead as public property after a time. Unclaimed corpses were handed over to physicians, artists, or in more superstitious areas burned to prevent haunting. One Flemish town kept a register of anonymous bodies for redistribution, like a grotesque civic lending library. Still, others clung fiercely to the integrity of the corpse. In parts of Italy, a family might hire night watchers armed guards to stand at the gravesite for 3 full days post-burial, not out of fear of ghosts, just thieves. In England, village charters occasionally included obscure penalties for disturbing ye resting bonies of thy neighbor. But those laws were rarely enforced unless someone powerful got robbed. Justice, as ever, was not equally distributed. A quirky detail emerges from the records. In some rural villages, the act of grave robbing wasn't punished as theft but as trespass. That's right, stealing a body was a land use violation, not a moral one. The landowner had rights. The corpse? Not so much. And here's where things get weirder. You hear of body brokers, people who didn't do the digging themselves but arranged the transactions, like real estate agents for corpses. They operated in cities, far from the grave sites themselves. A thief might hand off a load at midnight. No questions asked. By sunrise, it's in a surgeon's cellar or an artist's studio for anatomical sketches. No one knows who the poor soul was, and no one seems to care. But not all brokers are neutral. Some make choices. One story, probably half legend, but still chilling, tells of a man who refused to sell infant corpses to a known apothecary. Too much whispering, too many shadows in his shop, the broker said. The apothecary was later found burned to death in his home, surrounded by bones not yet turned to ash. Coincidence? Maybe. But as you've already guessed, ghost stories and grave robbing tend to walk hand in hand. Your giddies. He's still following you, leads you back up toward the main road. The sky has begun to gray at the edges. Morning approaches. Time to vanish. But as you step over a ditch, your boot knocks something hollow. It's a skull. Clean. Polished. With teeth. Someone dropped their goods. Or maybe someone meant for you to find it. You leave it where it lies. No need to carry that weight. The road curves east, away from the shacks and stench, back toward the towns where this strange commerce continues quietly, behind closed doors. For those who know where to knock, you can already tell, this is no longer just about desperation. In the next village, the buyers wear robes and read Latin. They call this progress. The road is dry, now cobbled in patches, rutted in others, but each step feels heavier, as if the weight of the dead clings to your heels. Ahead lies the city. Not the romantic, bustling kind filled with merchants and troubadours, but a gray mass of crooked roofs and smoking chimneys. You cross a narrow stone bridge and pass beneath an iron gate just before the bells toll dawn. Inside, you feel it instantly. A different atmosphere. Cleaner streets, perhaps, but under the polished surface, the same trade, only better dressed. You veer toward a long, square building with no signs, but windows that glow dimly with candlelight even in daylight. You hesitate, then step through a side door and into the hush of an anatomy theater. The smell is sharp herbs. Lye. Something tangy that catches in your throat. The walls are lined with benches rising in tiers, all focused downward toward a wooden table, stained dark and scarred. Behind it stands a man in robesible, lined with for lecturing in Latin, while waving a bone like a pointer. His students nod, their quills scratching diligently. And on the table, of course, lies the source of their attention. A naked human form, pale as wax, with the belly neatly opened and pinned. The chest has already been cracked, ribs splayed wide like fingers. The face is covered. They always cover the face. Too much emotion in a nose you might recognize. This is not a villain's lair. It's a university, a prestigious one. This lecture is considered essential for surgeons, midwives, even painters, especially painters. What you're witnessing is the early golden age of anatomy. Universities in Padua, Bologna, paracenters of learning competed for access to fresh corpses. They didn't ask many questions. And why would they? Bodies were hard to come by legally. Executed criminals, mostly. But those weren't always available, hence the demand. The professor pauses, then gestures toward the head. A student steps forward, hesitates, then pulls back the cloth. The face is young, freckled, the left eye slightly swollen. You wonder what her name was. Historians still argue whether these dissections did more good than harm, ethically speaking. Some say they paved the way for modern medicine. Others call it a brutal exploitation of the powerless, often the poor, the executed, the voiceless, sometimes all three at once. You glance around the room and spot a man lingering by the stairwell. He's not a student, not a doctor. He's too clean, too quiet. He doesn't watch the dissection, watches the students, evaluating. Maybe he knows where the next body will come from. After all, these lectures are held weekly. Where do they keep finding the supply? The answer lies in the back room, where jars line the shelves, floating hands, curled fetuses, half-sliced brains in brine. Some labeled, some not. A copper tub stands by the hearth, still steaming. You look in. The water is red. A young apprentice nods toward it. To loosen the skin, he explains casually. Makes it easier to remove the face. You manage a tight knot, as though this is all quite normal. And for them, it is. Anatomists in the Middle Ages were obsessed with cataloging the human form. Veins mapped like rivers. Organs weighed and compared. Skulls measured for signs of intellect or sin. There's even a quirky case in Florence where one anatomist insisted that melancholy could be found physically inside the spleen. He was wrong, but charmingly so. The most famous of these early dissectors? Mondino de Luzzi. He pioneered human dissection around 1315 and had the nerve to write manuals about it. His influence spread far and wide, and yet even he depended on anonymous, illegal corpses to build his legacy. You wonder if the students here know that, or care. Of course, not every student has access to a cadaver. There's a black market, always is. Some professors suggest to their most promising pupils where to look for independent study materials. Enter the body snatchers once again. Only now, they're not wearing rags. They've leveled up. A few act like businessmen, dressing well, quoting prices, delivering discreetly. One runs a full operation out of a tannery basement, sterilizing bodies with vinegar and rosemary. No trace, no stink, he promises. Just flesh. Some of these snatchers even provide custom orders. You want a male around 30, strong arms? No problem. You want an elderly woman? Perhaps to study bone brittleness? That'll take a few extra days. You hear murmurs of guilds forming informal. Of course. Groups of corpse suppliers agreeing on prices, sharing contacts, avoiding turf wars. Like merchants. But their goods don't walk themselves into market. Not all is secret, though. Artists of the time, especially those obsessed with realism, also sought cadavers. The great Leonardo da Vinci dissected dozens of corpses in his quest to understand movement, muscle, and grace. His drawings, still admired today, were born from cold slabs and silent bodies. Yet for every Da Vinci, there were a dozen less famous, less ethical painters carving bodies just to get the shadow of a collarbone right. You leave the theater just as the students begin closing the chest cavity, discussing whether hearts really did contain spiritus. One insists that love originates in the liver. The others snort and throw chalk at him. Outside, the day has brightened. A baker calls from across the square. The scent of fresh bread mingles with the memory of iron and salt from inside the hall. Somehow, the contrast makes it worse. You pause to reflect. This wasn't a dungeon or a graveyard. This was a school. And they needed bodies, like wood needs fire. Some will argue that it was worth it, that all progress comes with cost, but you're beginning to see that the corpse trade didn't start in darkness, it flourished in the light, in open-air markets and university halls. And it's about to get even more complicated. Because the church, it's watching, and it's not pleased. You drift away from the square. Your steps lighter now, though. Not from peace of mind. More like numbness. You've walked through graveyards and anatomy theaters, but the next stop brings its own flavor of unease. The church. Not the grand, echoing cathedrals with gold leaf altars and incense-thick air, but a smaller one, tucked between crooked lanes, ivy strangling the bell tower. Still, it stands tall, watchful. You step through the worn wooden doors, and the smell hits you. Beeswax, cold stone, something faintly musty, like wet wool. Candles flicker near the altar. A single priest, in a pale robe, arranges a chalice, whispering to himself. You take a seat on a rough bench and listen. It doesn't take long to realize that the church had opinions about bodies dead or alive, and those opinions were absolute. To the faithful, the body was sacred, a vessel blessed by God. And after death, it wasn't just a sack of bones, it was a promise of resurrection. Disrupt that, and you didn't just steal a corpse, you stole someone's afterlife. Grave robbing, to the church, was an abomination, an act that defiled not just the body, but the soul's path to judgment. Sermons were filled with warnings, fiery visions of grave robbers burning in hell, dragged down by skeletal hands. Yet, here's the awkward bit. Monks and clerics didn't always follow their own sermons. Historians still argue whether the early church was complicit or just careless, but records exist of monastic orders quietly trading in bones. Not just any bone, showy bones. Saint bones. Relics. And if they had to be stolen, well, God would understand, right? You watch the priest light another candle and tuck something beneath the altar cloth. Curious. You approach when he leaves. Underneath, a finger bone. Polished. Resting on velvet. Likely labeled something noble, like Digitus Sancti Benedicti. But it could have come from any grave, any hand. This is the relic trade. Welcome to one of the strangest corners of medieval hypocrisy. Relics, bones of saints, scraps of clothing, dried blood, even teeth were believed to channel divine power, healing, protection, prophecy. Pilgrims would walk hundreds of miles to see them. Cities became rich from the traffic, so naturally, demand skyrocketed. And supply? Well, you know the answer to that. Monasteries stole relics from each other. There's even a charming Latin phrase for it. Furta sacra, holy theft. The logic was both bold and absurd. If you succeeded in stealing a relic, it meant the saint allowed it. And if you failed, well, perhaps you weren't holy enough. Some relic heists were legendary. One group of monks allegedly smuggled a saint's body across the Alps in a barrel of wine. Another bribed a gatekeeper to unlock the reliquary after dark, then paraded the bones out in triumph, claiming divine blessing. And sometimes, the church endorsed the theft if it served the greater good. You can imagine the mental gymnastics involved in writing that sermon. But relics weren't only stolen. They were forged, faked, manufactured even. Whole economies sprang up around carving fake bones, aging cloth in smoke, or blending animal bones with human ones to pass off as holy remains. Want a toenail from St. Catherine? That'll be a silver groat. 2 for a penny if you don't mind sheep hooves. 1 fringe tidbit? A monastery once claimed to own not 1, but 3 heads of John the Baptist. Apparently, he had backups. The priest returns, and you smile politely, stepping back into the nave. He eyes you curiously, then resumes humming a soft hymn, the Latin words drifting like incense. The contradiction of it all lingers. The church condemns grave robbing while participating in it. Still, not every cleric turned a blind eye. Some did try to stop it. Records survive of bishops excommunicating body thieves, of priests hiring guards to protect cemeteries. One abbot in Germany even booby-trapped his crypt with a tripwire that rang a hidden bell in the bell tower. Unfortunately, it also rang when squirrels ran past. That bell didn't last long. In London, churchyards eventually began locking gates at night, some hiring watchmen armed with cudgels. But corruption often crept in, guards paid to look the other way, or even do a bit of digging themselves on the side. A story circulates about a parish in Bruges where a visiting bishop found a pile of bones under the choir loft. When questioned, the monks insisted it was leftover relic inventory. He was not amused, but deeper down, beneath all the scandal, is something oddly human. Fear. The fear of being forgotten, of being desecrated, of lying down forever, only to be dragged up again. You pass a side chapel and pause at a stone effigy of a knight. His armor is carved in loving detail, hands folded in prayer. Yet the marble beneath him shows signs of tampering, chisel marks, cracks. Someone tried to open it. Maybe they succeeded, because even the tombs of the noble weren't safe. A rich corpse was a treasure chest. Rings, brooches, gilded rosaries, and the bones themselves, valuable, especially if the person was rumored to be a martyr, a mystic, or just rich enough to seem magical. You walk back outside, blinking in the sunlight. The church bell tolls noon. Somewhere behind you, the choir begins to sing. A beautiful sound. But now you wonder if the altar is singing back. The church may have spoken of sanctity and eternal rest, but behind closed doors, bones were currency. And saints? Well, even the holiest bones ended up in someone else's sack. You head downhill from the church, boots crunching over gravel, as the path bends toward a squat, stone building surrounded by an iron fence. A gallows looms nearby, silent now, but not long ago, it was busy. A few crows still linger, pecking half-heartedly at the trampled grass. Welcome to the execution ground. There's no ceremony here, no crowd today, just the memory of rope and justice. And as you soon realize, the starting point of a different kind of trade. You glance toward a small cart by the fence. It's empty now, but its purpose is clear. Transporting corpses. Not for burial, no. For dissection. You've already seen the destination. This is the source. Executed criminals, murderers, thieves, traitors were the primary legal supply of cadavers for centuries. The logic was harsh but simple. If you forfeited your life, the state owned your body, and the state had plans. In England, the Murder Act of 1752, yes, that late, formally allowed judges to sentence criminals not only to death, but also to post-mortem dissection. A grim 2-for-1 special. But this began long before the law. It was already custom, ritual, punishment. Being dissected wasn't just about science, it was about shame. Total obliteration. Your soul might be judged, sure, but your body would be pried open in front of strangers, poked and sketched, and never buried. No grave, no prayers, just vinegar and hooks. Historians still argue whether these post-execution dissections were more about public spectacle or medical utility. In some towns, they charged admission. In others, they hung the dissected remains in shop windows. Morbid? Yes, but educational, they insisted. You walk past the scaffold and spot a small plaque, half buried in moss. It reads, "Here died Thomas Gray, hanged and opened, 1433. No tomb, just a footnote." And Tomias wasn't alone. Cities coordinated their executions around university calendars. Surgeons lobbied for bodies. Professors wrote letters requesting young males with strong sinew. One even demanded a fresh redhead, claiming the skin preserved better. He was wrong. By the way, gingers rot like anyone else. Still, supply rarely met demand. That's where things got creative. Sometimes, a condemned prisoner would be promised a clean death if he consented to dissection. Others were bribed after death by negotiating with their families. We take the body, and your debts are forgiven. Some families agreed. Others didn't find out until it was too late. One fringe case comes from Prague, where a man was executed for sorcery, and his corpse dissected live on stage by candlelight. Accounts say he twitched twice. Students argued for weeks whether that meant his soul was resisting or if it was just gas. You continue along the path to a low, brick building. Inside, a dim room lined with hooks, cloths, and tallow lamps. A man in an apron face lined, hand steady cleans a long blade with a damp cloth. You nod. He nods. No questions needed. He gestures to a narrow wooden slab, worn from years of use. You run your fingers along the grain. So many stories have passed through here. Most never told. Better they end here, the man mutters, than in a ditch. He's not wrong. Despite being steeped in horror, the study of the human body was, at times, a strange form of mercy. Some criminals weren't even given a proper burial. Others were dragged outside the city walls. But here on the dissection table they became something else. Subjects of study. Tools of progress. Of course, not everyone agreed. Religious groups expressed their disapproval. One bishop declared that no soul could ascend if the body had been tampered with. A pamphlet circulated claiming that dissections cause storms. Another warned that dissected bodies might rise on Judgment Day as deformed creatures staggering and incomplete. A medieval panic over the undead. A common joke at the time? Behave, or you'll end up in the Latin class. Still, public opinion began to shift. Slowly, the idea of donating one's body voluntarily was whispered among a few Enlightenment scholars. A woman in Paris was said to have left her body in her will to a surgeon, asking him to teach with kindness. And he did. Her name was later engraved on the lecture hall wall, a rare honor. But she was an exception. Most bodies brought in for study came from poverty, crime, or misfortune. A truth few wanted to admit. As you return to the city gate, you see a young boy peering through the iron bars toward the scaffold. He's holding a basket, waiting for something, or someone. You wonder if he knows what's going to happen next. At the end of the road, another cart slogs through the mud, covered in canvas, its wheels creaking. It slowly rolls toward the anatomy school. You don't need to ask what's inside. You leave the execution ground behind, but the image of the cart lingers a ghost with wheels, rattling forward into a world that sees value in the already dead. The sun has reached its peak now, washing the cobbled road in a sharp white light. You shield your eyes as you descend toward an older part of town walls cracked, the air thick with incense and something less pleasant. Here, a different kind of death economy thrives. No students, no professors, just monks and bones. The monastery looms ahead like a fortress, squat and fortified. Its windows narrow and high. Vines crawl over the stone, and the iron knocker on the main gate is shaped like a skull tasteful. You're greeted by a hooded brother who says nothing but gestures you inside. The interior is quiet, not wholly quiet bone quiet. A reverent silence that clings to your cloak as you step past arched doorways and enter what appears to be a museum? No, a reliquary. Hundreds of skulls stare back at you from polished shelves. Some are encased in gold leaf. Others sit bare, names carved into the bone itself. Femurs are stacked neatly in the corners. Finger bones dangle from chains like macabre wind chimes. You pass a glass-fronted cabinet labeled Miraculum, Occipitalis Sanctae, Brigida St. Brigid's skull. Probably, unless it's one of the other 12 verified Brigid skulls scattered across Europe. she got around. The monk explained softly, reverently, that the monastery has collected these remains over generations. Some were donated, some gifted, some, well, acquired. You don't ask how. This is the era of relic fever. Pilgrims travel for weeks just to kneel before a finger bone. Touching it is said to cure blindness. Seeing it might grant forgiveness. Merchants set up shop outside the gates, selling candles, ribbons, saint cards. It's Disneyland, but with more incense and slightly more skulls. And where there's demand, there's always supply. You're led down a narrow staircase into the crypt. It smells like cold stone and beeswax. The walls are lined with niches, each holding bundles of cloth-wrapped bones. Some have notes pinned to them, names, death dates, sometimes causes of death burned for heresy, plague victim, fallen knight. One bundle has no name, just a price. Donated, you ask? The monk hesitates. Recovered. Ah, there it is. The polite term. Recovered. As if the bones simply wandered off and were returned by a good Samaritan. Historians still argue whether monasteries like this genuinely believed in the spiritual power of relics or simply understood their economic pull. Pilgrims brought money, gifts, favors. A popular saint could fund an entire abbey for decades. A rare relic? Even better. Some monks became full-time relic hunters. They scoured ancient tombs, bribed gravekeepers, even faked miracles to justify their acquisitions. There are stories of monks disinterring recently buried holy men just to preempt relic theft by others. How thoughtful. One quirky detail. In Spain, it became fashionable to display saint bones in elaborately sculpted reliquaries shaped like the body part itself. So a thumb bone might be encased in a gold thumb, complete with tiny fingernail. Effective branding. Back upstairs, you're led into a side chamber where two monks are busy polishing skulls with linen cloths and rose oil. They chat quietly about weather and local politics while scrubbing decades of dust from jawbones. One monk gestures proudly to a peculiar exhibit, the fused skulls of conjoined twins, encased in crystal. Proof of divine mystery, he murmurs. You nod politely, resisting the urge to ask whether the mystery was how they got the twins in the first place. Another monk joins you and offers a curious tidbit. Some of these relics are on loan. Yes, loaned. Just like books. Monasteries sometimes trade relics temporarily to attract visitors. St. Cuthbert's tibia on tour. One relic was once carried from town to town in a velvet-lined box, greeted by parades. Not bad for a tibia, and the pilgrims? They believed. Deeply. Some walked barefoot for miles to see these bones. Others slept beside the reliquary, hoping for visions. A few even tried to steal slivers for themselves, a chip of saintly rib, to tuck into their shoe. The monks weren't always amused. One German abbey reportedly sewed spikes into the reliquary lining after several theft attempts. The Lord forgives, their abbot reportedly said, but we prefer to deter. You return to the main chamber where a single candle flickers in front of a jawless skull labeled S. Apolloniae, the patroness of dentistry, ironically. A single gold tooth gleams in her mouth. You realize then, these monks aren't so different from the grave robbers. The difference is scale, and polish, and Latin. You thank the monk and step back outside. The sun is lower now, and the breeze carries a mix of lavender and rot. As you walk away, you glance over your shoulder and catch sight of a wooden cart being pulled toward the back gate of the monastery. Covered in cloth. No questions asked. You already know what's inside. The road leading from the monastery curves gently toward a barren hill, where the grass is patchy and the air has a sour edge. You pull your cloak tighter. There's a stillness here that isn't peace, it's the kind that comes after screaming. You don't have to guess why. You've reached what the locals call the pit. It's not marked on any map. No cross, no stones, no fence. Just a shallow depression in the earth, maybe 24 feet wide, rimmed with twisted weeds and splintered posts. It looks like a crater, but it was made by shovels, not fire. This is a plague pit, a mass grave. You've read about them house cities, overwhelmed by death during outbreaks, like the Black Death of the 1340s, had no choice but to bury the dead by the cartload. No ceremonies, no names, just body after body, stacked in layers like cordwood, a grim lasagna of despair. You kneel near the edge and feel the dry soil crumble beneath your hand. It's been centuries, but the ground still remembers. Locals say dogs won't walk here. Some even claim you can hear coughing when the wind is just right. But you're not here for ghosts. You're here for the trade. Because even plague pits weren't immune to grave robbing. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Who would want a body riddled with bubonic rot? But you already know the answer. Apothecaries, alchemists, healers, charlatans. The medieval medical world was hungry for ingredients, especially rare ones. And nothing screamed rarity like plague-ravaged organs or pestilential bone dust. If someone died from disease, it was believed their body absorbed powerful, even curative properties in the process. Historians still argue whether any of this had a shred of medical merit, but at the time, it was widely accepted. The more gruesome the origin, the stronger the potion. You walk downhill and past the remains of a burned-out shack-blackened timbers, collapsed roof, herbs growing wild in the ashes. Local rumor says it belonged to a bone witch, a woman who scraped skulls clean with vinegar and lye, and sold the powder in wax paper packets for fever treatment. Just a pinch in your tea, one flyer advertised. Heals what ails, protects the home, keeps rats away. Quirky? Definitely. Legal? Not remotely. You arrive at a crooked little hut, nestled in the tree line, half hidden under thorn bushes. Smoke curls from its chimney. A wind chime made of tiny bones knocks gently against the doorframe. You knock. The door creaks open. Inside, a man with wild hair and soot-smeared spectacles peers at you through a haze of lavender smoke. He's grinding something in a mortar, the scent sharp and metallic. On his shelves, jars labeled Phlegm of Saint Vitalis, Shadow Root Extract, and Powdered Black Lung. He grins. Looking for plague goods? You shake your head, but you don't leave. He seems eager to talk. He tells you how, during the worst years of the plague, he and his father would dig by night, scoop skulls from the top layers of pits, boil them in a cauldron over oak fire, and powder the remains with a fine mesh sieve. Sold out every week, he boasts. Sometimes to bishops. He shows you a dusty box of preserved femurs. Aged nicely, he says, like a wine cellar. Might have belonged to a nun. You can tell from the density. You politely decline the offer. These men, and yes, occasionally women weren't working for science. They weren't students or surgeons. They were bone merchants, scavengers of death. They sold to healers, but also to sorcerers. Some claimed the powdered remains of plague victims could grant immunity if mixed into wine and consumed during the new moon. Others swore it could summon visions. Most, of course, just got sick. You thank the man, step out, and head back up the slope toward the pit. The wind has picked up now, rustling the weeds. You pause, staring into the depression, and can't help but wonder how many names lie beneath. How many stories ended here? How many were pulled out again quietly, illegally, greedily? One fringe case you remember. In Lubeck, a merchant was arrested for trying to export 2 full skeletons to Italy, where they were meant to be used in fertility rituals. His only defense? They weren't doing anything useful where they were. Charming. The church, of course, condemned all of it. Desecrating plague pits was considered not just a sin, but a blasphemy. Some bishops called it wounding the earth with a second death. Strong words, but they didn't stop the trade. You reach the top of the hill and take one last look down It's oddly peaceful. Birds chirp. The clouds drift lazily overhead. The field of the dead has returned to silence. But you know better now. This quiet doesn't mean it's over. It means they've just finished for the day. The road winds through brambles now, narrowing into what looks more like a goat path than a highway of commerce. But you follow it anyway, drawn by murmurs you've picked up in the last village talk of a strange cottage near the woods, where bones aren't just studied or sold, they're used. As the trees thicken, the light cools, shadows stretch longer, and the air carries the acrid sweetness of burning herbs. You step carefully. This is no place to twist an ankle and eventually you spot it. A lopsided thatched cottage half swallowed by vines, its windows painted black. This isn't a surgeon's den or a monk's reliquary. This is an apothecary. And the man inside? He greets you with a raised eyebrow and the wary calm of someone who's been accused of witchcraft more than once. His robe is stained with ash and something purple. His fingers are ink black, to the knuckles. He speaks before you do. You're not here for herbs. You shake your head. He smiles. The kind of smile that suggests the world's worst secrets are best kept behind locked teeth. Welcome to the forgotten side of medicine where death and magic overlap, and grave robbing becomes just another supply chain in a long, weird pharmaceutical recipe. You walk the shelves. Bottles rattle softly as you pass. Labels leap out. Powder of infant's rib, sooted lung tissue, distilled gall from executed thief. Some tinctures are suspended in thick oils, others in fermented wine. The air is thick with cloves, sulfur, and old regrets. The apothecary gestures to a small jar of gray powder. Crushed molar of virgin plague victim, he says flatly, as if listing cabbage at market. Ground with goat bile and mixed with mandrake. Cures fever. Supposedly. You don't ask where he gets his supplies. You already know. One dusty scroll describes a salve made from melted human fat, said to treat joint pain. Another references a mummy elixir, which included, yes, actual Egyptian mummies or just European corpses dyed with pitch and passed off as such. Historians still argue how widespread the use of real human remains was in medieval folk medicine. Some claim it was rare and sensationalized. Others insist it was shockingly common, especially among hedge witches, traveling healers, and alchemical dabblers who worked outside church-sanctioned practices. But here's a quirky fact for you. By the 15th century, mummy powder had become such a hot commodity that entire trade routes were rumored to exist just to meet the demand. Some nobles swore by it. Others wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot reliquary. Back in the apothecary's cramped workspace, you examine a workbench stained with all manner of unspeakable things. A leather-bound book lies open, its ink brown with age or perhaps something darker. It contains recipes that feel more like rituals than remedies. Powdered femur, boiled with sage and vinegar. Dried heart slivers stirred into honey for virility. A concoction of spleen ash, red wine, and rosewater. To banish melancholy. You spot a pile of scorched parchment scraps labeled witch's salt, made apparently by burning teeth and mixing the soot with morning dew. The apothecary shrugs. Some works, some doesn't. Most is faith. He pulls back a curtain to reveal a locked cabinet. Inside, more bones. Smaller ones. Child-sized. You step back, not out of fear, out of the quiet, creeping horror of how much has been normalized in these walls. High demand, he says softly. People believe innocent bones make the strongest charms. Not true. But belief sells. He says his clients come from all walks of life. Nobles looking for potions to ward off betrayal. Soldiers buying tooth pendants for good luck. Pregnant women seeking protection charms. He's even served priests. Off the record, of course. You sit by the hearth, where a small cauldron bubbles with something greenish. He offers you a cup of soothing tea. You decline. Politely. As the fire crackles, he leans back and muses. You know, There was a time I thought this work was sacred, that I was healing people. But when a woman comes to you begging for the bones of her dead son to bring him peace, and you have to lie to her, that's when the smell starts to stick to your skin. You nod, unsure of what to say. He continues, half to himself now. The worst part isn't the digging. It's the pretending it still matters where the soul went. Outside, the sky has shifted. The last golden streaks of light filter through the trees. You rise, thank him, and step out into the woods. He doesn't follow. As you walk, you notice something hanging from the tree-small charms. Bone fragments wrapped in cloth and string, clacking softly in the breeze. Protective wards, the locals call them. You duck beneath them, mindful not to disturb the air too much. It's tempting to laugh at the superstition, but part of you wonders if you hung a scrap of bone at your door, would it keep them away? And who exactly is them? You reach the edge of the forest just as the last light fades, and the hills beyond seem to breathe a little deeper. Medicine, magic, gravel robbing, they aren't separate paths here. They're one twisted, thorny road muddy with tradition, belief, and desperation, and you're walking right down the middle of it. You emerge from the shadowy woods onto a winding hillside trail, boots damp from moss and soft clay. Ahead, the road leads not into silence but toward pilgrim songs. You hear them before you see them. A low hum of weary voices, the clatter of wooden walking sticks, the jingling of charms sewn to cloaks. You round the bend, and there they are, a slow-moving line of travelers' dozens, maybe hundreds making their way toward a distant monastery that glows in the dusk like a beacon. Their clothes are patched, their sandals worn thin, but their eyes shine with hope. Hope for healing, hope for redemption, or perhaps just hope for a miracle bone. This is where grave robbery turns holy. Relic tourism was the medieval version of a blockbuster attraction. A good saint could transform a sleepy village into a miracle machine. One healing? Great. Two? Worth the walk. Three? Get ready for a roadside economy. Taverns, candle sellers, indulgence hawkers, and, of course, relic thieves. You mingle with the pilgrims, nodding politely, dodging the occasional donkey. Some carry jars of earth to bless. Others weep openly. A woman clutches a doll made of straw and whispers her child's name. At the front of the procession, a man in a wide-brimmed hat announces, "We are 7 leagues from the shin bone of St. Leodegar." You whisper to the woman beside you, "Is that confirmed?" She shrugs. "They say he once turned a river backwards." Ah, very scientific. You arrive at the monastery by candlelight. Pilgrims flood through the gate. Inside, a heavy gold reliquary rests atop an altar, like a sleeping dragon. Its glass lid reveals a long bone, wrapped in red silk and surrounded by white lilies. A monk stands nearby, swaying with the incense, chanting. He tells you this is St. Leodegar's actual leg, or his third leg, depending on who you ask. Historians still argue whether some of these relics were real, swapped, or quietly manufactured from local bones. The truth? It didn't matter. Belief was the engine and belief needs no receipts. One quirky tale? In Cologne, a church proudly displayed 11 skulls of the 3 kings. Either they had extra heads, or math wasn't a strong suit in the 14th century. You explore the side halls and notice locked chests lining the wall seach, marked with names, dates, and small brass handles. These are relic vaults. Inside, not just bones. Some hold pieces of cloth soaked in saintly sweat. Others, hair, teeth, even a single vertebra. These were the medieval world's VIP passes. Monasteries would sometimes lend them to noble houses. Traveling nobles carried relics into battle. One duke supposedly wore a rib of Saint Maurice in his helmet. He lost the battle anyway. Probably should have brought the rest of the saint. Relic stealing wasn't always a nighttime crime. Sometimes it happened in broad daylight. One infamous example: the monks of Conques, France, desperately wanted a miracle, working saint to attract pilgrims. So they sent a brother disguised as a visiting monk to steal the bones of Saint Foy. He befriended the guardians, waited 2 years, then smuggled her out in a basket. When he returned home, the town threw a party. Ethics? Optional. This kind of holy theft was so common it earned its own category. Furta sacra the sacred robbery. The logic was creative. If you succeeded, it was clearly divine will. Saints, after all, were believed to protect their own relics. If you managed to steal one, clearly the saint wanted to leave. It's like a celestial version of finders keepers. You climb a stone staircase that spirals up to a high tower, where a monk guards a special relic, the tongue of Saint Anselm, preserved in amber. He claims it still whispers at night. You might be joking. He might not be. He admits, quietly, that monks from another abbey tried to swap it once with a pig's tongue. But they made it too clean. A real relic's got a little dust. You nod. Of course. Downstairs, pilgrims kneel before reliquaries. A child presses his forehead to the glass. An old woman drops a coin into a wooden box and whispers, "Please let the cough go away." You stand in the back of the room and watch as the bones shimmer in the candlelight. Whether or not they ever belonged to a saint, they have power now. Not divine, perhaps, but cultural, emotional, economic. One relic can feed an entire monastery for a year. A newly discovered one? Even better. That's why relic hunters scoured battlefields and crypts and quiet graves. Not for God. For revenue. You step outside, the stars blinking into view overhead. Near the gate, a man with a limp chats with a merchant in a hooded cloak. You can't hear the words, but the merchant produces a small velvet pouch and hands it over. Inside, a bit of bone, maybe from a dog, maybe from a saint. The man pays without question. You realize then that relic theft isn't just about bones. It's about desire, the longing to touch the eternal, to find comfort in the tangible. And people will pay dearly for that feeling, even if it comes from someone else's grave. The monastery gates close behind you, and once again, you find yourself on the road only this time. It's wider, muddier, and covered in deep ruts. You're no longer among peaceful pilgrims or shuffling monks. Out here, the rhythm is faster, louder. Wheels clatter, boots pound, horse snort. You've reached the outer edges of a battlefield. It's not active now. The fighting ended hours ago or maybe days, but the land still aches with violence. Broken spears jut from the earth like rotten teeth. The air hums with flies. You step over a shattered shield and a single gauntlet, fingers curled upward as if still reaching. You brace yourself. The dead are here, and so are the scavengers. Unlike the quiet grave robbers of the cemetery, these ones are bold, quick, and rarely alone. They move through the wreckage like clockwork, knowing exactly where to look, exactly what to take. A gold ring here, a steel dagger there. Boots are highly prized good leather, is hard to come by. But what you're here to witness is something stranger. These aren't just looters. Some are corpse harvesters collecting bodies, or parts of them. You crouch behind a splintered wagon and watch as one man yanks a helmet from a fallen knight, then carefully slices away the ears. Another ties a rope around the ankles of a half-armored body and drags it toward a waiting cart. There's no ritual, no reverence, just efficiency. You follow the cart as it creaks toward a waiting tent on the hill. Inside, a surgeon's sleeves rolled, apron blood-stained waits with open arms. Literally. He begins inspecting the bodies the way a cook might inspect fresh vegetables at a market. That one's too crushed. This one's too decomposed. Ah, here's a fresh one. Why? For dissection? Not always. Sometimes, just for parts. Medieval armies were short on everything: money, weapons, skilled healers. If a surgeon could study wounds on a real body, he could better treat the living. If he could salvage a leg or two for anatomical diagrams, even better. And then there's the darker market. Historians still argue how widespread the use of battlefield corpses was in medical training versus religious rituals or sorcery. But clear accounts exist of bone wagons following armies not to bury the dead, but to repurpose them. Some commanders even sanctioned it. One German knight paid a bounty per body delivered to his camp surgeon. Fresh from the field, he called it. No need to dig. You walk among the bodies now, trying not to look too closely. Some lie face up, eyes open. Others are half buried in the churned soil, arms reaching as if still fighting. The silence is deafening. A boy passes you carrying a sack of hands. Yes, just hands. He tells you without breaking stride that they're for a local alchemist. Love's night fingers, he adds. Says they're full of truth. You're not sure what that means, and you don't ask. Further down, a small group of monks pick through the fallen. Not for bones, for souls. They whisper prayers, draw crosses in the air, sprinkle water from dented tin flasks. But even they aren't above practicality. One priest pockets a ring before moving on. To fund the burial, he mutters, as if convincing himself. Quirky detail? On some battlefields, it became tradition to remove the heads of notable warriors not as trophies, but to preserve them in salt and send them home. Families would display the skulls, proof of honor and sacrifice. One family in France, reportedly, had a wall of head 6 generations, cleaned and shellacked. You step around a ridge and find a trench, half full of tangled limbs. A scribe sits nearby, cataloging the bodies. He uses a small knife to scratch numbers into bones ribs mostly. He tells you the surgeons want to study impact trauma. You nod. He doesn't look up. Elsewhere, horses lie bloated in the grass. A bueno older than 12 is pulling out the teeth with pliers. For charms, he explains. Horse teeth keep fevers away. Or give them. Depends on the phase of the moon, apparently. You walk past a fire pit where a group of scavengers have built a rough table. They're sorting bones. Skulls here. Long bones there. A single femur sits beside a cup of wine. To the brave, one of them says, raising his cup. This battlefield wasn't just a place of death. It was a harvest. When cities heard of war nearby, some even sent collectors. They'd follow behind the army, not with weapons, but with carts and ledgers. They weren't grave robbers. They were resource managers. War made everything valuable, even the dead. Eventually, the church tried to intervene. Edicts were issued. Bodies were to be buried with dignity. But enforcement? Spotty at best. After all, bones couldn't complain, and most bishops had never fought in the mud. You crest a final hill and look back. The field stretches out behind you, littered with metal and memory. A single crow flaps over the ridge, silent. Below, the scavengers keep moving. The carts keep rolling. And the dead? Well, they're still giving. The road away from the battlefield feels oddly serenrolling hills, tall grass, the soft rhythm of your boots on packed earth. For a moment, you could almost forget where you've just been. But as you pass a crumbling stone wall and see a manor house rising on the horizon, you remember, not all graves are shallow, and not all thieves wear rags. This is noble land. You can tell by the gates wrought iron, half rusted but grand, with ivy creeping over a family crest. The manor looms beyond, gray stone and peaked roofs, like something carved from a thundercloud. Inside, behind stained glass and silk curtains, lie the prestigious dead. Or rather, they used to. You slip around the back of the estate toward a family crypt set into a hill. Its door is ajar. That's your first clue. You duck inside. It's cooler, hair-damp, and sweet, like rotting lilies. Rows of stone coffins sit along the walls, each etched with names, dates, and the kind of Latin only rich people get. But one lid is missing. Another is cracked. A third has been chiseled open. You peer in. It's empty. Welcome to the world of elite corpse theft. Most people assume grave robbing was confined to paupers' cemeteries or plague pits. Not true. In fact, noble tombs were prime targets not just for their jewelry and gold-threaded burial clothes, but for the bodies themselves. And here's the twist. Sometimes they weren't stolen. They were commissioned. Behind closed doors, wealthy collectors paid handsomely for exotic bones. A duke might want the femur of a knight who died in Jerusalem. A bishop might prefer a skull from a Nordic raid or something with character. And where the buyers exist, so do the suppliers. You exit the crypt and follow a servant path up toward the manor house. Inside, the smell shifts. Beeswax polish, old books, dry parchment. A man in velvet robes greets you. He's not surprised by your arrival. He assumes you're here for the cabinet. He leads you to a narrow study where glass display cases line the walls. One holds ancient coins, another, bones, labeled bones. Hand of Sir Alaric, killed at sea, 1289. Vertebra of an unknown knight, Battle of Crecy. Tooth of an abbot, origin disputed. The man pours himself a glass of wine. He calls this his anatomical curiosity collection. He says it like he's discussing pottery. You ask if the bones are real. He chuckles. Some, most. Who can say? Here's the part that historians love to squint at. The noble fascination with death was more than morbid hobbyism. It was about status. To own a saint's relic was good, but to own the actual bones of someone famous or infamous? Even better. And so, tombs were raided. Quietly. Often by the very people in charge of their upkeep. Crypt keepers. Priests. Groundsmen. In one recorded case, a family exhumed their own ancestor to gift his skull to the king. The king used it as an inkwell. One quirky tidbit, Queen Elizabeth I allegedly owned a finger bone, taken from a Saracen prince. Whether she believed it or not is unclear, but she certainly displayed it. And that's the thing. Bones became trophies. You walk through another hall, this one hung with portraits. Men in ruffled collars, women in lace, all frozen in oil paint. Their tombs, meanwhile, may no longer contain them. Somewhere beneath the finery, the noble dead have become collectible. You find a spiral staircase leading to the cellar. A servant offers to light the way. You decline. Downstairs, the air thickens. The floor is packed earth. Wine barrels line one wall, but it's what's behind the barrels that interests you. A hidden chamber. Small. Cold. Inside, rows of boxes, all labeled. Neat cursive. Names you don't recognize. Some marked with small red dots, maybe those are the for sale pieces. You pull one open. Inside, a skull. Not cleaned, not polished. Just wrapped in linen and stored like winter clothes. You close the box and leave it be. Collectors like this don't see themselves as criminals. They see themselves as preservers. That's the word they use. They preserve history, lineage, mystery. Some even write treatises on the subject, claiming they protect bones from decay or desecration. Meanwhile, entire crypts are left empty. You return upstairs and pass through the grand foyer. The nobleman gives you a nod, then returns to his wine. A fire crackles in the hearth. A dog dozes on a rug. It's all very civilized. Until you remember the hidden boxes. The reality is this. The bones of the rich were rarely allowed to rot in peace. They were too valuable, too portable, too tempting. Some were sold. Some were stolen. Some were displayed like souvenirs. And some, perhaps, the most unfortunate, were faked. Because where there's demand, there's always a workaround. Even if it means digging up someone else's past and selling it off one vertebra at a time. The manor fades behind you as you follow a narrow track down the slope, past stone walls flecked with moss, and toward the edge of a churchyard that's too small, too quiet, and too perfectly square. The wind whistles low as you duck under an archway just wide enough for a wheelbarrow and enter a little-known corner of the medieval world. You're in a gravedigger's domain. You hear the shovel before you see him. Rhythmic. Steady. almost soothing. The man digging doesn't notice you at first, he's too absorbed in the motion, like a monk at morning prayer. His coat is threadbare, his hands calloused. He looks like any other laborer, but this one wears two faces. By day, he works for the parish, keeps the ground tidy, buries the dead, marks the graves, mends the fences. A respectable job. Quiet. Necessary. But by night, he's a merchant of marrow. You crouch behind a tree and watch as he finishes filling in a grave too fast. No cross, no stone, just earth patted smooth. He glances around, then walks calmly to a shed at the rear of the yard. He opens it, slips inside, and doesn't come out for a long time. When he does, he's wheeling a small cart, empty. You follow from a distance as he pushes it into the far corner of the graveyard behind a yew tree, where the ground looks darker. He kneels, rolls up his sleeves, and starts to dig. No markings, no mourners. This is not a reburial. This is collection. You creep closer as he levers open a wooden lid. Inside, wrapped in burlap, is a body, still dressed. He doesn't flinch. He reaches in, pulls the cloth tighter, and begins to lift. He works fast, experienced. You imagine he's done this 100 times, maybe more. And he's not alone. Gravediggers across Europe, especially in towns where physicians or artists were nearby, developed quiet side businesses. They had keys to crypts. They knew the schedule. They could intercept a fresh burial before the family even left the chapel. Historians still argue whether churches were truly unaware or simply pretended not to notice. After all, the grave was still filled. The prayers were still said. What lay beneath? Best not to ask. You watch as the man hauls the burlap sack into the cart and covers it with straw. A dog barks somewhere in the village. He pauses, then begins walking down the side road, disappearing into the mist. You follow the cart tracks back to the shed. It's unlocked now. Inside, a lantern burns low. The walls are lined with shelves, some empty, others stacked with bones in burlap, labeled in charcoal. Young female, consumption. Soldier, no hens. Child, buried shallow, recheck freshness. You shiver. There's a ledger on the table, ink smudged, bound with string. You flip through it and find names not of the dead, but of buyers. Guild, hospital, apothecary, and one just labeled painter in red cloak. One quirky detail. Tucked inside the ledger is a small diagram of a coffin with a notch labeled hook entry point. Apparently, he doesn't always dig fully. Sometimes, he just fishes the body out with a long hook. Less effort, less mess. Back outside, the wind picks up. You notice that some of the headstones here are false, just thin wooden markers stuck into empty soil. Others are real graves, with nothing left inside. And yet, the gravedigger is no villain in his own story. He's paid poorly by the parish. His home is barely larger than his tool shed. He feeds 2 children and keeps the churchyard clean. He just sells the extra inventory. You head back through the archway and pause by a roadside shrine. Someone's left flowers there. You kneel to read the inscription. Blessed are those who sleep undisturbed. Bit of wishful thinking, really. In towns like this, even the most peaceful death could lead to an unauthorized second act, especially if the deceased was young, whole, and fresh. Those were prime cuts. Older bodies, disfigured or decomposed, were harder to move. But a clean cadaver? Gold. In fact, some gravediggers kept track. They'd make small marks in the church's death register, coded symbols indicating harvest value. A crescent moon for fresh, a star for embalmed. A black dot meant, don't bother. Some went further, maintaining waiting lists. One surgeon in Prague allegedly reserved 3 corpses a week in advance. Delivery expected within 2 nights of burial. Eventually, people noticed. One noble family began exhuming relatives just to check. In some cases, the coffins were filled with rocks, a classic trick. Weight for the mourners, profit for the digger. The church tried to crack down. Some gravediggers were flogged. Others were publicly branded on the hand with a tiny shovel. But many were protected by silence. After all, if the church punished every dirty secret in its yards, there'd be no one left to run them. You leave the cemetery and pass the gravedigger's cottage. A single candle burns in the window. Behind it, two children sleep by the fire. You understand now. In the world of medieval corpse trade, guilt rarely stayed with the living. It seeped into the ground, into ledgers, into carts wheeled through fog, and sometimes it was buried right back into the same soil. The village slips behind you, its shuttered windows and sleeping children cloaked in twilight. The moon is high now, painting the world in shades of ash and pearl as you descend toward the open plains. You follow a gravel path toward a crooked wooden sign half swallowed by vines. It reads, "By order of the Crown, disturbance of burial sites shall be punished by law." Well, that sounds official, almost comforting. But as you keep walking, you realize the sign is riddled with arrow holes. One corner is scorched. A goat is sleeping underneath it. So much for law and order. You've reached the heart of the legal gray zone, the place where rules about the dead were scribbled, crossed out, rewritten, and mostly ignored. Welcome to the awkward, inconsistent world of medieval corpse laws. At first glance, you might think grave robbing would be simple to legislate. Don't dig up bodies. Don't sell them. Don't turn Aunt Margaret into bone powder. But it wasn't that straightforward. You step into a dusty municipal hall empty now, except for a half-drunk guard snoring beside a hearth. On a shelf near the door, you find a ledger of local laws. It's an odd mix. Stealing a body, fine of 6 shillings. Selling a skull to a healer, 12 lashes. Or public shaming. Disturbing a bishop's grave, death by hanging. Removing relics from churchyard, unclear. See Bishop Odo. Yes, unclear. It turns out that medieval law around grave robbing was a patchwork of tradition, guesswork, and pure improvisation. It varied wildly from town to town, even within the same country. Sometimes it was treated as theft, other times as blasphemy, and sometimes, oddly enough, as trespassing. You pause to read a curious case. A man in Lincolnshire, arrested not for stealing a body, but for inappropriate use of consecrated soil. That's right. His crime wasn't taking the corpse site, was stepping where he shouldn't have. Historians still argue whether these legal inconsistencies were intentional ways to protect certain interests or simply the result of fragmented medieval governance. Whatever the reason, the result was chaos. You step back outside and wander into the marketplace, long since closed for the night. By torchlight, you notice a small posting board nailed to a bakery wall. Torn notices flap in the breeze. Beware the man who walks with bones beneath his cloak. Reward offered for the return of my brother's jawbone. Seeking legal protection for grave of Agnes. Will pay. That last one catches your eye. Because that's another strange feature of this era. You could buy protection for your grave. Wealthy families often paid for extra burial rites, fence installations, heavy coffins, armed watchmen. In one notable case, a baron paid a stonemason to install an iron cage over his tomb and wrote in his will, "Should anyone pry, let them find only metal and wrath." Charming. But the most absurd part? Some nobles weren't trying to protect against thieves. They were protecting against the church. Yes, in regions where ecclesiastical law ruled, the church often claimed rights over holy ground. If they decided a grave was improperly blessed, or if a family owed unpaid tithes, they could exhume the body and hold it hostage. One quirky tidbit. A bishop in 1380, one held a merchant's skeleton in a tower for 7 years until his family paid back church debts. They called it purgatory on layaway. And what about punishment for the thieves themselves? You might expect harsh sentences. And sometimes, sure, a few were hanged, especially if they were caught disturbing the graves of nobles or clergy. But most, they were fined. whipped, occasionally made to walk naked through town with a bone tied around their neck as a warning. One town forced a convicted grave robber to dig every new grave for the next decade, but only for the poor. A poetic sentence, if nothing else. Yet in many cases, authorities looked the other way, especially when the body was donated to a university, a bishop's library, or an alchemist with powerful friends. You wander through the outskirts and find a tiny, weathered stone hut with a wooden placard above the door. Office of the Dead. It's a small clerical archive used to record local deaths, grave locations, and burial permits. Inside, you find a folder marked Missing Bodies 1420, 1437. There are 9 pages, hundreds of names. Next to many of them, a single word: vanished. Others are stamped, transferred, presumed sold, or the eerily vague, processed. Processed? That's a word better suited to meat than memory. You step back out and close the door gently. By now, you've realized that the laws meant little without enforcement, and enforcement meant little without consistency. Grave robbing wasn't just crime, it was a tolerated crime, a tolerated business. After all, who was going to complain? The dead? And those still living? Well, as long as it wasn't their mother, they looked away. You stand in the moonlight, watching it spill over the crooked fences and empty streets. Somewhere nearby, a shovel strikes stone. Somewhere else, a lock clicks open. And somewhere, a magistrate pours wine and signs a form marked Body Unaccounted For. Business as usual. You walk into dawn. The sky peels open in streaks of soft gold and milk gray, and the first rooster crows from a hill somewhere behind you. The world should feel cleaner now, fresher. But instead, it feels thin, like parchment stretched too many times. Because the longer you travel these medieval roads, the clearer it becomes. Stealing the dead was normal, accepted, feared, profitable, inevitable. But that doesn't mean the thieves slept easy. You arrive at a wayside shrine, little more than a wooden cross hammered into a hillock, but it's covered in ribbons and tiny trinkets, dried flowers, iron nails, bits of bone carved with strange symbols. The wind makes them chime softly. Protective charms, they say. You know what that means. You've entered the realm of ghost insurance. It sounds ridiculous at first, but think about it. You spend your nights digging up the dead, hauling their bones through churchyards and back alleys, slicing them into medicinal doses, or letting students hack them apart on a slab. Eventually, you start to wonder, what if they come back? You're not the only one. Even hardened grave robbers had their superstitions. Some left coins in empty coffins to appease the spirit. Others whispered apologies before cutting the flesh. A few wore talismans around their necks, usually made of bone, because naturally, only bone could protect against bone. You sit at the base of the shrine and remember the story of Ewan the Dechera, famed body snatcher who, legend says, was followed home by the ghost of a nun he'd sold to an anatomy school. He swore she stood at the foot of his bed each night, frowning, never speaking, just watching. He started sleeping in graveyards after that. Said it kept her away. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely feared spiritual revenge or simply used it as a moral bandage. It's not my fault, a thief might say. I was cursed, but fear was real. So were the precautions. You walk through a village on market day. Women haggle over leeks. A blacksmith shoes a mule. And in the town square, a small group of men are gathered around a cart not full of goods, but of talismans. Fingernail of the blessed dyer prevents ghost dreams. Twine woven from funeral linen keeps spirits at bay. Tooth strung on flax hang over door to block visitations. It's nonsense, of course. But no one laughs. You ask one seller if he's ever seen a ghost. He doesn't answer. Just holds up a bottle filled with what looks like soot and whispers, "This kept my brother breathing." You don't press him. There were other customs, tour rituals to cleanse a stolen body before use, bathing it in wine, wrapping it in holy cloth, whispering the Lord's Prayer backward. One manual from Italy even recommended rubbing the corpse with garlic and burying a single clove under the left heel so the soul cannot walk. Quirky? Yes, but common. Some robbers even wore masks not to hide their faces, but to confuse the spirits. Others placed mirrors around their homes so ghosts could see themselves and flee in shame. A few went so far as to pay monks for silent blessings, just in case. One notorious relic thief in Avignon, nicknamed Three Toes Marcel, built a small chapel beside his home. Every time he sold a body, he lit a candle inside. When he died, the townsfolk said they found over 200 melted stubs on the altar, and not a single body in his family crypt. The church, unsurprisingly, condemned all this. They called it heresy, blasphemy, a denial of divine protection. But even the clergy weren't immune to fear. One bishop reportedly hired a body snatcher, then had him buried upside down to trap the ghosts beneath the earth. You pass a barn with strange markings carved into the beams. Circles, spirals, stars. Local lore says this was once a storage shed for fresh cadavers awaiting delivery. Now, children say it's haunted by the weeping skulls. Maybe it is. You pause at a hill where 5 stakes rise crooked from the grass-aunts, used to display the heads of grave robbers. A deterrent. It didn't work. But the ghosts? They might. You find a stone bench and sit beneath a tree, letting the breeze lift your cloak. For a moment, the wind shifts, carrying with it the smell of loam, of candle wax, of old secrets. It occurs to you that this entire world was built on paradox. They feared ghosts, but dug up their neighbors. They honored saints, but traded their bones. They prayed for the dead, and sold their remains. Maybe that's why they created so many rules, so many rituals. If you sprinkle enough herbs and mumble enough Latin, maybe you won't hear footsteps behind you when you're alone. Maybe the dead will forgive you. Maybe you'll forgive yourself, but probably not. Because whether you're stealing from medicine, magic, or money, a part of you always knows you weren't supposed to open that grave. The road slopes downward now, back toward the edge of the world you started in that first quiet graveyard. With its uneven stones and whispering trees, you recognize the crooked fence, the lopsided cross, the earth that always seems a little too soft. It's nearly full circle, but something's different this time. The place is still, not quiet in the usual way, not empty, just still, as if the whole landscape is holding its breath, waiting for the last word in a long, long sentence. You follow a narrow path between graves, your fingers trailing along the cool moss of one marker. The names are mostly worn away, but here and there, you spot a familiar chisel style. Someone took pride in these. It's almost funny, isn't it? All this carving, all this ritual, all these stone boxes in the earth. And yet, so many of them didn't stay full. This, right here, is the final chapter in the strange, uneasy tale of medieval grave robbing, not a dramatic end, but a slow retreat. A fading, you reach a bench beneath a twisted yew tree and sit. It creaks beneath you like it remembers who's come before. The wind rattles through the branches above, and somewhere in the village, a rooster crows too early. By the late 1600s, the tide had turned. Society began to shift. Slowly, reluctantly, but it shifted. Public opinion soured on corpse theft, not because people suddenly grew more moral, but because they grew afraid of what it meant. The body was becoming more than a shell. Science no longer needed to steal. Medicine began to ask. Politely, occasionally, even legally. Hospitals started writing contracts. Governments passed laws allowing execution victims to be donated, yes, donated, though they rarely had a choice. Medical schools began petitioning for cadavers. The business of bones became paperwork. It didn't stop the thefts, but it reduced them. Historians still argue whether this decline was driven more by progress or by shame. Was it conscience? Or just bureaucracy? Was it enlightenment or exhaustion? Some say it was public scandal that turned the tide. Anatomy lectures gone wrong. Coffins found empty. Priests caught selling bones by the cartload. One thing's certain. New burial technology helped. Heavier coffins, mort-safe cages, security patrols in city graveyards. In some places, families took to branding their loved ones' bones with heated iron, just in case they were stolen and needed to be identified. Grave robbing never vanished, of course. Not entirely. It shifted, went underground, became the tool of quacks and the desperate, rather than institutions. But the medieval heyday? The open carts? The scholar orders? The saint heists? That age faded like candle smoke. You glance around the churchyard and realize it's no longer a market. Not here. Not anymore. Just memory now. You stand and walk slowly toward a row of newer graves, Victorian maybe. Smooth marble. Flowers still fresh in a few pots. Nothing disturbed. Everything still. Yet as you turn to leave, you catch one final detail. A small hole, barely more than a mouse burrow, near the base of a gravestone. Probably nothing. But then again, old habits die hard. You make your way back to the road, boots light now, mind heavier. The sky has shifted into morning, pale blue peeking between scattered clouds. A breeze picks up, gentle and cool, carrying with it the scent of grass and something deeper. It's quiet. For real this time. And in the stillness, you realize this story has never really been about bones. It's about what people do with fear, with poverty, with faith. It's about how far they'll go to survive, or to be remembered. It's about what we leave behind and who dares to pick it up. And just before you crest the hill, you turn for one last look. The cemetery rests beneath you like an open book. Each grave a chapter, each stone a sentence. And beneath them all, a history that was never supposed to be told. But you know it now. And the dead, it seems, have stopped whispering. You made it. You walk through graveyards and back alleys, past apothecaries, plague pits, and prayer halls. You saw what others tried to bury, and you listened to the stories no one wants to remember. Now, you can rest. Let your breath slow. Let the edges of the room blur. Let the memory of damp soil and flickering candlelight drift far, far away. There's no need to hold on to anything. Not the cold of the crypt. Not the silence of the battlefield. Not even the names carved into stone. Those stories will wait. Right now, all that matters is the weightlessness of your body, the softness of your pillow, the warmth that grows behind your eyes as they begin to close. You've walked a long road tonight, but it led somewhere gentle. Here, in this moment, there are no digging tools, no ledgers, no footsteps in the dirt, just the hush of night, the quiet hum of the air, and the safe knowledge that this journey is over. So breathe in and let it go. Sleep comes easy now. Sweet dreams.